Good morning, beautiful people. Hold on, gotta get a thumbnail. Oh my God. Anyways, how are you doing? Hope you're having a great day so far. I know I am. Anyways, what do I want to talk about today? Let's get straight into it because I have a lot to yap about today. Well, I want to talk about training for strength versus training for hypertrophy, why they are different in the data, and why I think the data is wrong. Now, that is controversial, right? Oh, you're evidence-based, you're supposed to agree with the data. Now, this is where it's funny because I'm on the fence of whether I'm science-based or evidence-based. What do I mean by that? Well, evidence-based is basically you look at what does the outcome data say, right? And if you're evidence-based, the science-based people are going to call you an outcome cell, which is just so ass backwards it makes no sense, but whatever. And the science-based people, they call themselves mechanistic lifters, right? So they don't really care what the outcome data says because they are all about mechanisms, right? How does it work? I want to know how it works. And if the outcome data doesn't match my mechanism, then it's the study that's flawed. So while I agree that we should have mechanisms, right? Because we shouldn't be Dr. Mike saying, we don't know what happens in the deep stretch. We know what happens in the deep stretch. But at the same time, if our mechanism isn't being shown repeatedly in the outcome data, maybe the mechanism's off, right? Unless you have a good reason for why you think your outcome data isn't showing what the mechanism should. In this case, the difference between hypertrophy and strength training. So when we think about hypertrophy, right, there's two different types of hypertrophy. Well, three. So the first is sarcoplasmic. This one is not the one that we train for. This is just an increase in the amount of sarcoplasm, right? So you can think of it as it's kind of swelling. And the other one is myofibrillar hypertrophy. This is what you want, right? Myofibrillar addition. So we're adding myofibrils. We're increasing the size of the muscle fiber. Now, how does this work? Well, we don't know for sure, but our best guess is that you add myofibrils in parallel, right? So each one, you add them in parallel until you get to the point where you need to split, until it gets so big to where it then splits. And then now you have two new myofibrils, and those ones now grow within. And then once they get too big, then they split. Because we've seen there's only really two studies that we use when we're talking about how does myofibrillar addition really work. And they're kind of old, and they're not in humans, so that's the other thing. But it's hard to do things like this on humans because of ethics, ethics slowing down science, what's new. But anyways, yeah, pretty much myofibrils get added until it's too big, and then they split, and then you grow them again, and then that series continues. That's how muscle growth works. It is not broken down and built back up, for fuck's sake. I mean, in a way it is, but that's not what they meant when they say that that's how it works. Anyways, yeah, that's what we're training for, right? Is we want myofibrillar addition. We want new contractile proteins. So, the third type of hypertrophy, stretch mediated. So this is just adding sarcomeres in a series, right? So that's essentially like making the muscle longer. And of course, sarcomeres are the contractile proteins. So it's at the end of the day, it's the same shit. We're adding new contractile proteins. It's just where we're adding them is different. With stretch-mediated hypertrophy, it's at the ends of the muscles. And with myofibrillar, it's just in parallel. So, those are what we want to train for. Stretch-mediated is it has a cap. Well, so does myofibrillar addition, but stretch mediated has a cap, and you reach it pretty damn fast. Myofibrillar, you ain't gonna reach that most likely ever for most people. And you have to, of course, both of these, you have to keep adding. And how does it detects? The stimulus is detected by, you have mechanoreceptors that detect mechanical tension, and then it kicks off the biological process of mechanotransduction, which is basically taking that mechanical tension, and your muscle's like, hey, there's a bunch of tension here, a lot of it. So we need to create more contractile proteins so that we can reduce the amount of tension that's happening. We need to get stronger, because then it won't hurt as much. Because your brain doesn't like pain, believe it or not. So your brain's like, hey, you know, we tried really, really fucking hard to move this weight and I couldn't. So I need more contractile proteins so that I can accomplish this task. And all of this to say, we're adding more contractile proteins. Thus, we should be able to create more force. So hypertrophy should have a pretty good correlation with strength, right? You can't, in theory, you should not be able to hypertrophy, unless it's sarcoplasmic, without, because that one, you know, it's just increasing the sarcoplasm, you're not adding contractile proteins. So you should not be able to hypertrophy by adding sarcomeres in series or adding sarcomeres in parallel without getting stronger, because you have more contractile proteins, thus more force production. So why is it that in the data that you can hypertrophy to a greater degree than you can increase strength? Because we know that you can increase your strength without hypertrophying. There's about 6 different mechanisms that increase strength, and only 2 of them are hypertrophy. Like I said, you have myofibrillar addition and stretch mediated hypertrophy, or adding sarcomeres in a series. So those are the 2 hypertrophy related strength outcomes. But other than that, you have like increases in lateral force transmission and reductions in antagonist coactivation. You have motor learning. The other 4 are essentially all tendon stiffness. You have all of these other factors that are not muscle growth that can make you stronger. So you can get stronger without adding muscle, but you should not be able to add muscle and not get stronger. That just doesn't make sense. And so essentially there has to be something that's wrong with our outcome data that's inflating this. And the problem that I think it is, well, first of all, we can't detect the differences between sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and myofibrillar addition. We just don't have the technology right now. So that's the first one. But the other thing that we can't detect the difference between is edema or swelling. Now, a lot of people think that this is an overstated problem in hypertrophy research, but then they give you no explanation as to why they don't give you an explanation as to, okay, how did I hypertrophy then and not get stronger? How did I add muscle and not get stronger? Even if we're doing, because you could say, oh, well, in certain cases, you know, it's because they used a 1 rep max to measure strength and they weren't trained on that. Okay, fair. But what about when they do an MVC, a maximum voluntary contraction? This is basically where they hook you up into a dynamometer. It's basically a machine that keeps you as stable as possible. And you just do a pure flex. It's like an isometric, you know, it is isometric. You try to basically just activate your muscle as hard as you can. It's like maximum voluntary contraction. It's as hard as you can contract your muscle on your own fruition. So that has no motor learning required. It's just try really hard to flex. And in the cases where we have hypertrophy observed but no MVC increase, they have no explanation for that. I do, it's edema, but they don't like that explanation. Or it's sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Again, still not the one that we're gunning for. And the edema is a problem because edema swelling, it can stick around for a while, right? They've done studies where they essentially just purposely beat the hell out of people. They'll do eccentric overloading, which is where you'll do eccentric only training. So they've done them in the biceps, and because the biceps are super easy to measure. That's why if you ever are wondering, why are all of the studies done on the quads and the biceps and the triceps? It's because they're easy as hell to measure. That's why. Because it's hard to measure things like the lats and the delts. That's why everyone wants there to be a study that compares lateral raises to shoulder press for delt growth, but there isn't one. There's only activation studies, and that's why. And basically, yeah, that's the problem, is it's edema or it's sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Because when we look at the meta-analyses, right? There's 3 that came out of Dr. Zordos's lab, and there's the Pelland and there's the Remmert. Yeah, well, yeah, because Pelland is 2 in 1. So Pelland is volume and frequency, and then the Remmert one is per session volume. Oh wait, no, there is another one there, because there's a reps in reserve one, proximity to failure. But so it's, I guess, kind of 4. But the Remmert one is the per session volume, and the Pelland one is the frequency and weekly volume. And they found massive differences. So essentially, when you're looking at a meta-analysis, right, they're technically the gold standard, but a meta-analysis is only as good as the data that you put into it, right? A meta-analysis only shows you this is what the data says. This is just compiling what the data says. So if you put bad data in, you get bad data out. And that is what I think has happened here. I think this is a problem with both the Pelland and the Schoenfeld meta-analysis. Because when we're looking at the hypertrophy programs that they're using volumes that are just so high that they are frankly not recoverable. And this is, again, a very hot topic in the fitness space. But I challenge everyone who thinks that hypertrophy training and strength training should be different with, okay, then how are you growing muscle and not getting stronger? How? With a maximum voluntary contraction test, how are you not getting stronger if you have new muscle? Give me a mechanism. Make it make sense. You can't. Right. Okay. So what did these meta-analyses find? Well, they basically found that our data sucks. Like, flat out. The Remmert one found that, so they both did Bayesian analyses to find what's the best way to present this data. And they looked at direct sets and fractional sets and total sets. So a total set would be a bench press is 1 set for triceps, 1 set for pecs. That, no, didn't work out. Then fractional sets will be, okay, bench press is 1 set for pecs and half a set for triceps. Now, in the Pelland, for strength and for hypertrophy, that represented the data the best, was fractional sets. However, in the Remmert meta, the fractional was better for hypertrophy, but the direct was better for strength. Interesting. And what did they find? Well, they found that first of all, they found diminishing returns, but it was not very steep in the Pelland meta. It was basically the more volume, the better, which does make sense, but there has to be a cap. There has to be a cap. Because at some point you are going to be too fatigued. There's a volume level that you are going to be too fatigued to actually be growing. And they didn't find that. They didn't find that in the Pelland meta. And even Pelland himself was like, yeah, both Pelland and Remmert have podcasts on Iron Culture where they talk about their meta-analyses and what they think and how they interpret their data. And both of them essentially said that they don't necessarily agree with their own data. They really haven't changed a lot of how they program and for themselves or for their clients based on their data. And it's because they had to make so many assumptions, right? These meta-analyses are using data from, there was of course inclusion criteria, but it was trained, it was untrained, it was, 4-week studies and 12-week studies, and it's just this huge conglomerate of everything. And that's just what happens. So anyways, they found that for hypertrophy, they said do 10 to 20 weekly sets, fractional. So this is, and then it was about, I don't remember if they even reported how many direct sets to do, but it was 10 to 20 fractional sets was pretty much the sweet spot. But you could go up to 30 and you would still technically be getting hypertrophy. So explain to me how that's not just edema. Explain to me. And you can't. So for strength, they found that it's like four weekly sets. They found that strength also has that 2 and 3 times frequency is about the same. For 3 is minimally better. And then when we look at the per session volume, they found that for direct sets, it was about 2 sets per muscle group, and for strength. And then for hypertrophy in direct sets, it was 8-ish. And it was 11 if you do fractional sets. So the metas don't even match up with each other. And this is again shows you that the work is not finished, right? You can't just look at a meta-analysis and say, I have solved resistance training. Now you don't pop in all the studies and say, okay, now I know exactly how many weekly sets I need to do. I know how many times I need to work out per week. I know how much intraset volume to do. I know the reps in reserve I need to go to, because they don't match up with each other. And I think that's the best way to really show you that meta-analyses, while they are touted at the top of the evidence hierarchy, again, they're only as good as the data that is in them. So anyways, this just goes to show, I haven't even really talked about my recommendations. My recommendations is to use the strength data. Do direct sets. And because when Remmer was talking about how they calculated everything, he basically found that the reason why direct sets was better for strength is because we'll use the bench example again, it would be like 0.16 sets of triceps from your bench. So you can't just give it an arbitrary, okay, this is 0.5. So it's easier to just measure it in direct sets, especially because as you become more trained, this was the other problem with them not distinguishing between trained and untrained subject. First of all, you have the issue of what is trained and what is untrained is not a set thing in the literature. It's not like, okay, this is trained. You have to be able to, for some studies, right, it's already hard enough to find people to do studies in general, and then it's even harder to find trained people to do studies. I've talked about this in the past, but it's like, especially if you're a trained person, you're gonna say, okay, I know that you like the gym because you're clearly trained. However, the program you're running right now, you have to stop. You need to come in and do my program. And if it's a good study, it's most likely a within subject. So it's going to create an imbalance, right? If I'm testing what does this do on biceps? A good study is going to be within subject, which means the control is yourself. So you're doing the control program on your right bicep and the experimental one on your left one. So you're saying, hey, come in and ditch your training program, do my experimental one and my control one on yourself, create an imbalance in whatever muscles you have, eat exactly how I want you to eat, and you need to do this, and you need to come into my lab to do this, and you need to do it for at least 8 or 12 weeks. I wouldn't do that. Most people wouldn't. That's why it's hard enough to find anyone to do it, let alone a trained person, right? Especially because you can't pay them very much money to do this, because it's a study. They didn't get a ton of money to fund it most of the time, unless it's something that's funded by a bigger corporation. Like, I know resistance periodization, as much as I'm not a fan of Dr. Mike, I am a fan of the fact that his company funds studies, and they fund good ones, because they fund ones that are ran by Dr. Helms and other ones. They've funded studies done by, what's his name? Jeff Nippard. Jeff Nippard's been doing some great studies. But yeah, strength training, hypertrophy training, the only real difference is that with strength training, you don't need to go to failure. You can probably stay around that 3 reps in reserve, because you're not really trying, with strength training, you're trying to perfect a skill, right? Because you have weight caps in strength training. In powerlifting, you have weight caps, so you don't really want to put on a ton. You're not trying to put on muscle, you're trying to get better at a movement, and that's a skill development. That's why you're essentially training for those neurological adaptations, and you're trying to just make them better and better and better. And so the rep ranges that you should use are, you know, if you subscribe to the stimulating reps model, which I do, you have on average 5 stimulating reps per set. And so any rep range of, I would say, some people say go 4 to 7. I really don't think that that's a good rep range for most people. Is it the most optimal rep range? Yeah. I would say 5 to 7 is the most optimal rep range, in my opinion. But for a lot of people, when they are doing, because 5 reps is like 85% of your max load, So you are going to be, that's heavy. If you've ever done a 5 rep set, that is heavy. And a lot of times, especially with newer lifters, your form looks like shit when you do a 5 rep set. And going into those higher rep ranges is not going to kill you. Everyone is so afraid of fatigue at this point that they're afraid to have good form. And the reality of the situation is you're still growing your type 1 fibers that are very fatigue resistant. So go ahead and take, the other thing is they want to dead stop and do all this when we literally have multiple studies, and again, a meta-analysis. This was a great meta-analysis on on concentric and eccentric timings. What did they find? It does not matter. You have similar gains, similar hypertrophy outcomes from doing a 1 second eccentric and up to a 4 second eccentric. So just do a 3 second eccentric to standardize your range of motion, right? And standardize the form. Because when you're tracking progressive overload, you want it to be the same task. But 9 times out of 10 with these low reps, people are not, they're changing the task. And that's just not what needs, it's not progressive overload. You're doing a different task. And so yeah, I would say 5 to 7 reps, 5 to 8 reps, honestly. 5 to 8 reps, use a 3-1-0-1 tempo. You're not going to die from being in the stretch for 1 second. And you're also not going to die from being contracted for 1 second. But you are going to standardize your form. Now, as you become more skilled at whatever you're doing, you could get rid of the pause you could get rid of these pauses, or you could at least make them like a half-second pause. But I think it is very important for not even just beginners, even intermediates, especially if you're switching to an exercise that you haven't done in a while, or you maybe have never done. Get a feel, right? Get a feel for what it's like to be in that fully contracted position. Get a feel for what it's like to be in that fully stretched position, to initiate the movement with the target musculature. Right, I flip back and forth on this because if you have good form, and you have good setup and execution, even if you aren't feeling the muscle, something is moving the weight. 9 times out of 10, if you have good form, good execution, well, 100% of the time, if you have good form and good execution, whatever is moving the weight is your target muscle. But most of you don't have good form and good execution. So how should we train? I keep getting off topic, but I think these are all good, important things to talk about. The first thing is train hard, right? 0 or 1 rep in reserve. The best way that, since we know that you should probably be doing 2 sets per muscle group at a minimum, the best way to do this, to learn what failure, you can't do 1 rep in reserve if you don't know what failure feels like. So the best way to learn what failure feels like and to learn how to gauge where your reps in reserve is your first set, do 1 RIR. Do 1 rep in reserve. And then your second set, go to failure. And this is where you can test how accurate you are at testing your reps in reserve, because the data shows us, yeah, leaving a rep in the tank, 2 reps in the tank is going to give you just as much gains as going to failure. However, the data also shows us that the average person, even the trained person, is complete dick at telling how far away they are from failure. They're normally off by, I think it was 3 to 5 reps. 3 to 5 reps, brother. What? Yeah, so go to failure on your second set and test. So ideally, you're going to lose a rep from your first set to your second set. So if I went to failure and I got 7 reps, my second set, I would get 6, going to failure again. So that means you should get the same amount of reps on your first set and your second set if you go 1 RIR, 0 RIR. If you don't get the same amount of reps, let's say you get 7 reps on the first one to 1 RIR, and then you go to failure, you get 7 reps again, that just means that your first set was actually 2 RIR. Okay, now you know how that felt. Ideally, you were using a good tempo, so you actually had the time to ingest and see, okay, that's how that felt. So train 0 to 1 RIR, 2 sets per muscle every day. Train 3 times a week or 2 times a week if you don't have the time for that. If you want to train 3 times a week, you're going to have to do full body or upper lower 6 times a week. If you want to train 2 times a week, you have like a million different ways that you can train. It's not gonna make a huge difference, but again, just 3 times is most likely going to be better, right? The outcome data doesn't really show it. Again, this is the mechanism side. I think you're probably better off going with 3. So we know that 3 is better than 2. Leave 1 rep in the tank and go to failure on the other set. And in terms of total session volume, right, sticking to around that 10 to 12 set range is probably going to be pretty good. And that's not to say that you can't go over that. That's just a minimum, right? Because if we're looking at 10 sets, that's 5 exercises. That's going to be a pretty good amount of time. So I would set your floor at 10 and train hard. That's the important thing. But anyways, this was kind of a rant and a yap sesh, kind of me just getting out my thoughts. I hope y'all learned something. If you did, drop a like, subscribe, comment. I love y'all. Peace out.